On the first day of construction, when the ground still smelled of wet soil and fresh steel, he turned to me, smirk curling on his lips, and said, "You're just good with tools." He didn't whisper it. He didn't joke. He said it loud enough for the crew to hear, loud enough to make a few heads turn, loud enough for laughter to spread in little ripples across the site, the kind of laughter that cuts deeper than an insult. That moment was meant to put me in my place, to nail me down into the role he had chosen for me. Nothing more than a laborer, a pair of hands, a silent shadow standing in the mud. But he didn't know the truth. He didn't know how many nights I had spent hunched over my desk, ink smudging my fingertips, eyes burning as the lamp flickered over rolls of paper filled with calculations and dreams. He didn't know how many times I had redrawn a line, erased and redrawn again until the building I imagined stood straight and alive in front of me, long before the first stone touched the ground. To him, I was a man with a hammer. To me, I was the one who had breathed shape into steel and glass. His words weren't just a dismissal. They were betrayal disguised as banter. I had trusted him once, trusted his promises, trusted the way he said, "We're in this together." But now, standing under the winter sky with wind biting at my ears, I realized what he was carving. Not stone, not legacy, but my erasure. With one smirk, he was chiseling away my name, burying it beneath his voice, his charm, his lies. I felt the hammer in my grip grow heavier, as though it carried the weight of every unspoken truth I couldn't shout out right there. My jaw tightened, my chest burned, but I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, not because I agreed, but because I understood something he didn't. Silence can wait. Silence is patient. Silence, when armed with proof, can roar louder than any boast. And as I looked at the steel rods piercing the sky, I told myself the vow that would keep me standing through every sneer and every slight. One day, the building itself will speak. One day, the truth will rise higher than his laughter. And when it does, no smirk in the world will save him from the weight of what he tried to steal. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to you. And now, let's continue. I carried his words with me long after the laughter on the site had faded. They followed me home like dust in my lungs, settling heavy in the silence of my small apartment. I had always loved silence, the kind that let me think, the kind that gave space for ideas to grow, the kind that felt like a companion rather than a void. But that night, the silence turned on me. It wasn't restful. It wasn't kind. It pressed against my chest like a weight, reminding me of every sacrifice I had made, every hour I had given, every plan I had drawn, all reduced to one careless phrase. "You're just good with tools." I sat at my desk, the same desk that had carried my life's work. The wood was worn smooth from years of leaning over it, the surface covered with fading pencil marks, smudges of ink, fingerprints that belonged only to me. Rolled up drawings leaned in the corner like forgotten soldiers, each of them carrying pieces of my mind, pieces of my heart. I looked at them and felt a hollowness grow, as though his words had stripped them bare, as though all the weight of my effort had been erased in an instant. I remembered the nights when the city slept, and I stayed awake, tracing lines under the dim light of a lamp. My back ached, my eyes burned, but I didn't stop, because the building I saw in my head was worth it. I wanted something that would stand when I no longer could, a structure that would outlast me, a proof of my existence. Every bolt I calculated, every beam I aligned wasn't just engineering, it was me carving a place in the world. And now all of it had been swept aside, brushed off as if I were no more than a pair of rough hands on a work site. The emptiness cut deeper because I had let myself trust. I had believed that recognition would come in its own time, that the truth didn't need defending. I told myself that people saw more than they admitted, that eventually effort spoke louder than pride. But that night, staring at the half-finished sketches on my desk, I realized how fragile hope can be when it isn't protected. His voice had cracked something inside me, something that no blueprint could hold together. And yet, beneath the ache, something else stirred, a quiet hurt that didn't weaken me, but hardened, like steel under fire. I thought of all the men who had been forgotten, their names lost while others took the credit. I thought of my father, whose work lived in old houses that no one remembered he had built. I thought of the countless times I had been told to keep my head down, to be grateful just to have work, to never ask for more. And suddenly I knew this silence couldn't last. One day, whether he wanted it or not, the building would carry my name in ways no smirk could erase. Memory has a strange weight. It does not press on your shoulders like stone, but it pulls from within, like an anchor hidden in the chest. After that day, when he stripped me down to nothing more than good with tools, I could not escape the pull of memory. It came back with every echo of metal on the site, with every creak of scaffolding. My mind returned to the nights when the building was not yet a structure, but a fragile idea balanced on the tip of a pencil. I remembered the first lines I drew. The paper was so thin it almost tore beneath the weight of my hand. My wrist trembled as I laid out the foundation, afraid that even a single miscalculation could ruin the dream before it began. Yet, in that trembling there was something sacred, like holding a newborn for the first time, terrified of your own strength, terrified of making a mistake, and yet unable to stop loving what you're shaping. Every line that followed was steadier, more confident, because I began to see it. A building that would not only stand, but speak. A building that would belong to the city, as much as it belonged to me. No one knew those moments. No one saw how I sat alone in the still hours before dawn, hunched over blueprints while the lamp hissed with a weak filament glow. They didn't hear the sound of my eraser scraping against the page, didn't see how my hand cramped from redrawing a single curve until it bent with perfect grace. They didn't watch me trace windows that would let in more than light. They would let in life, a rhythm of morning and evening for those who would one day sit inside. To everyone else, it was just a project. To me, it was a child growing in secret, fragile but destined to stand tall. The memory of those nights is what made his words cut so deep. He hadn't stolen from a worker. He had stolen from a father, of an idea, of a creation that cost me more than hours. It cost me pieces of myself I never got back. You cannot give years of your life to something without leaving a shadow of your soul in it. And that building, still climbing into the sky one beam at a time, carried mine. I could not sleep without dreaming of it. I would walk by the site in the early mornings when the cranes were still and the ground was quiet, and I would see in my mind what it would one day become. It wasn't just steel and glass. It was a story, one I had written line by line, and yet, as the walls rose, no one knew my name was written beneath them. They saw him, they heard him, they believed him. That was the cruelty of memory. It reminded me of what was mine, and at the same time it showed me how easily others could erase it. I carried both truths inside me, the pride of creation and the sorrow of invisibility, and with every day that passed, the weight grew heavier, until I realized that memory alone was not enough. At some point, the truth would have to leave the paper and stand in the open, the way the building itself already had. He was always there, just a step ahead of me, the kind of man who could make a room bend toward his voice without lifting a finger. He knew how to laugh at the right moment, how to slap someone's back with the perfect weight of false warmth, how to turn silence into a stage for his charm. People liked him because he was easy to like, quick with a joke, quick with a story, quick with the kind of confidence that never trembled. In every meeting, in every gathering, He stood as the face of the project, and behind him, in the shadow he cast, I stood as the man who knows his way with tools. The truth was invisible to those who didn't want to look. He had a talent, yes, but it wasn't in building. It was in taking. He could take your effort, your words, your ideas, and wear them as though they were stitched to his skin. He wore my work like a suit tailored to his size, and no one questioned whether it fit him. They saw his smile, his certainty, his polished shoes, and they believed he was the architect of the dream rising in steel and glass. I had watched it happen before, in smaller ways, long before this building. In conversations where my thought became his suggestion seconds later, and people nodded as though brilliance had just sparked in his mind. In contracts where his name appeared above mine, even when the labor had been mine alone. In stories told at dinners where he painted himself as the visionary, while I was left as the silent companion who was simply good with tools. At first, I had told myself it didn't matter, that the building would stand regardless of who claimed it. But as each day passed, I saw how much more he was willing to take, how hungry his pride was, how determined he was to make the world forget I had ever been there at all. The cruelest part was how naturally people accepted it. They wanted a hero they could point to, someone who fit the picture of leadership they had always carried in their minds. Loud, confident, untouchable. They didn't want the quiet worker in the corner of the room, the one whose hands were raw from nights of sketches, whose eyes carried the weight of calculations and revisions. They wanted the man who spoke loudly, not the one who created silently. And so, he became the face. I became the shadow. He shook hands. He smiled for cameras. He stood at podiums with words that didn't belong to him, and the world applauded. Meanwhile, I was the ghost on the edge of every photograph, blurred, unnamed, unnoticed. The building grew taller every week, and with it, so did his reputation. They called him the architect of vision, the mind behind the masterpiece. And me, I was the one who knew how to use a hammer. I told myself I could endure it, that truth would one day break free of his grip, but each time I saw him laughing, shaking hands, claiming a credit he had never earned, a deeper wound opened inside me, not because he had taken something from me, but because everyone else let him. And in their silence, in their willingness to believe the louder voice, I began to understand just how much of my identity he was stealing. Not just the work, not just the recognition, but the very story of who I was. And that theft, I knew, was something no man had the right to take. The betrayal did not come with thunder or shouting. It came quietly, with a hand pressing down on my shoulder, his smile warm, his voice steady, as he leaned close and said the words that would echo in my chest for years. Trust me. I remember the weight of that moment, the way his grip felt almost brotherly, almost protective. I remember the faint smell of ink and paper in the conference room, the polished table reflecting the documents laid out before us. I remember thinking, foolishly, that after everything we had built together, after all the nights of sweat and silence, there could still be honesty between us. I signed where they told me to sign. My hand trembled slightly, not because of doubt, but because of the gravity of what those pages represented. A lifetime's worth of work, condensed into a few lines of legal language, a monument written not in stone or steel, but in ink. I believed in that instant that my name would stand beside his, that the truth of what we had done could not be erased by clever words or careful omissions. I believed that trust still had weight in a world where so much was built on lies. But when the documents came back, neatly bound and stamped with the authority of law, my name was gone. Erased, as though I had never been there, as though I had never given my life to the design, as though my hours and years had dissolved into air the moment the ink dried. His name shone alone, clean, untouched, the sole author of a creation that had never been his to claim. The betrayal was not only in the papers. It was in the way he avoided my eyes when I flipped through the pages, searching desperately for the place where I should have been. It was in the way he laughed too quickly when someone congratulated him. It was in the silence that followed when no one noticed the absence of my name. That silence was worse than any insult. It was the sound of erasure complete. I sat there, staring at the signatures, the stamps, the weight of legal permanence. My throat tightened, but no words came. I wanted to slam my hand on the table, to demand an answer, to tear through the polite fabric of that room with the raw truth of what he had stolen. But I didn't, because in that moment I understood something terrifying. The betrayal was already finished. The theft had already taken root. He had not just stolen credit. He had stolen the story of my life and sealed it behind a wall of paper that no one would question. When we left the room, he clapped my back as though nothing had changed. The others shook his hand, offered their praise, spoke of legacy and vision. I walked out among them like a ghost, my footsteps hollow, my name swallowed, and I realized then that trust, once broken, doesn't shatter like glass. It corrodes like metal, slowly, invisibly, until one day it collapses under the weight of its own rust. That day was the first time I felt it. The hollow truth that I had not only lost recognition, I had lost my place in the story of the very thing I had created. And that, more than anything, was a betrayal that cut deeper than steel. The building began to rise, floor after floor, steel piercing the sky like a testament to ambition. To the world, it looked like progress, like triumph, like the vision of the man whose name was printed on the contracts and whispered into microphones. To me, it was something more complicated, something both proud and painful. It was my child growing taller while I was forced to watch from the shadows. I knew every detail of its skeleton. I could walk past the site and trace with my eyes the hidden reinforcements no one else would notice. The weight-bearing beams I had agonized over. The way each angle carried not just calculation, but intention. Every curve had been measured against years of learning. Every column balanced between strength and grace. I could see, even from a distance, the lines I had drawn long ago come alive in steel. Yet to the rest of the world, I was no more than a pair of hands who had once held a wrench, now discarded, now silent. My work was hidden deliberately, tucked beneath the grand gestures he performed. When cameras arrived, he stood tall in his tailored suit, pointing to beams he had never touched, speaking of designs he had never seen in their raw form. He spoke of vision, of artistry, of legacy, and the crowd nodded, dazzled by his certainty. And me? I stood among the workers, indistinguishable in my dust-stained clothes, unseen, unacknowledged, as though the very structure rising behind him had not been born in my sleepless nights. It was like watching my own name being buried beneath concrete. Each new floor poured above it, sealing it deeper, erasing the fingerprints I had left on the pages of those early sketches. They treated me as though I were just another tool, useful when needed, put away when not. Tools don't get remembered. Tools don't get credit. Tools don't have stories worth telling. That was the role he wanted for me, and for a time, I let him believe he had succeeded. But I carried the truth with me, as sharp and heavy as iron. In my home, stacked carefully in drawers and cabinets, were the original plans, the sketches in my hand, the signatures in my ink. They were fragile, yes, but they were undeniable. They whispered to me each night, reminding me that silence did not mean surrender, that being hidden did not mean being gone. And so, as the building climbed higher, so did my quiet resolve. Each floor added not only to the skyline, but to the weight of what he owed me, what the world owed me. He thought he had buried me beneath the concrete. He thought I would fade into the background, a nameless figure swallowed by time. But he didn't understand that the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, waits. It waits in shadows. It waits in silence. It waits until the day it can no longer be ignored. And I knew that day would come. The day of the opening ceremony arrived, with banners, cameras, and applause that seemed to shake the air itself. The building stood complete, gleaming against the sky, a monument not only of steel and glass, but of every breath I had poured into its creation. Yet as the crowd gathered, it wasn't my name they cheered. It was his. He took the stage with a confidence that had become second nature to him, his smile wide, his hand lifted, as if blessing the very structure that rose behind him. The cameras swarmed, catching his every gesture, his every polished word. They painted him as the visionary, the mind, the architect. And I, standing pressed among the crowd at the back, was no more than a shadow watching my life paraded as someone else's triumph. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from a rage so deep it reached my bones. I clenched my fists until my nails dug crescents into my palms, the sting reminding me that I was still alive, still here even as they pretended I wasn't. I felt the injustice in every heartbeat, in every cheer that rose for him, in every camera flash that sealed the lie a little deeper into the world's memory. The stage was his, but the weight of the building, every beam, every angle, every silent calculation, was mine. I remembered the nights bent over the desk, the lamp flickering while I wrestled with lines that refused to fit until they finally bent into perfection. I remembered the exhaustion, the isolation, the quiet victories no one ever saw. And as I watched him stand there, his voice rolling across the plaza like a sermon, I realized how thoroughly he had stolen not just credit, but identity. He had become the face of something that had once been my soul. To the world, he was the creator. To me, he was the thief who had carved my name out of history with a smile and a handshake. The applause rose again, and I felt it like a slap. I wanted to scream, to break the silence that bound me to the ground while he stood exalted, but my voice caught in my throat. Years of swallowing words had left me mute in the moment that mattered most. I stared up at him, my rage simmering beneath a mask of stillness, and I understood that something inside me had reached its limit. This was the breaking point, because as much as he wanted the world to believe his story, as much as the cameras wanted his smile, I knew a truth he could never erase. The building itself carried it. Every wall, every window, every hidden beam bore the mark of my mind. He could stand on the stage and claim it 1,000 times, but the structure behind him was mine, and one day it would speak louder than his voice ever could. And in that moment, as the applause thundered around me and my hands shook with fury, I made a vow. I would not remain in the shadows forever. The laughter carried farther than his words, rippling through the crowd like a wave meant to drown me. He had spotted me there, pressed among the people, silent as always, and with the arrogance of someone convinced of his own untouchable power, he tossed out the line once more. What would he know? He's just good with tools. It was meant to be a joke, a casual dismissal disguised as humor, but it landed like a blade twisting in an old wound. The people around me chuckled, some softly, some openly, their eyes flicking toward me with a mix of pity and ridicule, as though I had been unmasked for what I truly was. My chest tightened, not from shame, but from the raw, burning fury that surged inside me. I had endured so much. His stolen words, his stolen credit, his stolen legacy, and through it all I had told myself that patience was strength, that silence was dignity, that the truth would someday rise on its own. But in that moment, hearing the laughter that turned me into a caricature, I realized silence had become a prison. Each time I had swallowed his insults, I had allowed him to grow bolder, to write the story deeper in his own name. And now, in front of cameras, in front of the city, he mocked me again, confident that no one would ever question him, that my place was forever at the edges, invisible and voiceless. I felt my hands shake. not with weakness, but with the force of everything I had buried. The blueprints flashed through my mind, the hours spent bent over fragile paper, the trembling hand that drew the first line, the hundreds of corrections that followed, the quiet victories of solving what seemed unsolvable. I thought of the nights when I gave pieces of myself to a vision that no one believed in until it stood behind him, gleaming, undeniable. And now that same vision was being used as a weapon to humiliate me. The crowd's laughter echoed, but beneath it, I heard something else. The sound of my resolve hardening, like steel cooling into shape. It was as if every insult, every omission, every stolen word had been forging me for this moment. My silence had protected me once, but now it suffocated me. If I kept swallowing my truth, there would be nothing left of me to remember. He would have not only stolen my work, but erased the very existence of the man who created it. And so, while the cameras caught his smile and the crowd repeated his laughter, I knew the time for waiting had ended. This wasn't just about dignity anymore. This was about survival, the survival of my name, my work, my truth. He had mocked me one time too many, and the sting of it cracked open something that could never be sealed again. In that moment, I did not yet know how I would act, or when, or where, but I knew this: I would not let the story end with his laughter. When the echoes of his laughter refused to leave my ears, when the sting of that day gnawed at me long into the night, I returned to the place where I had hidden the only thing that could never lie. In the back of my closet, beneath layers of dust and years of quiet resignation, there was a folder. It was old, its edges frayed, its surface stained by time, but inside it lived the truth, untouched, undeniable, waiting. My hands trembled as I pulled it free, not from fear, but from the weight of everything it carried. I placed it on the table, the same table where those drawings had first been born. For a long moment, I just looked at it, afraid to open it, afraid of what it would mean, because once the truth was in the light, there would be no turning back. My silence had always been a shield, but this was a weapon. I finally unfolded the flap and saw the yellowing paper, the faint marks of graphite, the deep strokes of ink. The first sketches lay on top, fragile but proud, my handwriting etched across the margins, notes scribbled in the corners, corrections layered over corrections, until the lines stood clean, certain, alive. And there, at the bottom of each page, was my name, signed in my own hand, a signature pressed into the fibers of the paper like a heartbeat. I touched it as though it were sacred, because in a way, it was. These drawings were not just evidence of labor. They were proof of existence, proof that I had not been a shadow or a ghost, but the mind that gave birth to a building. They were the voice I had been denied, the testimony I had been too patient to speak aloud. No speech he gave, no smile he performed, no lie he repeated could erase what these pages carried. The paper had aged, the ink had faded, but the truth had not. I remembered the nights I had signed them, alone, exhausted but proud. I remembered thinking that those signatures would mean something one day, that they would ensure I was never forgotten. And then I thought of the moment he placed his hand on my shoulder and told me to trust him. How easily trust can turn into a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. How quickly a name can be erased when no one is watching. But here, in my grasp, was the part he had never touched, the part he could never steal. The folder felt heavier than steel as I closed it again. It was no longer just a collection of papers. It was my defense, my shield, my sword. If the world needed proof, I had it. If his voice grew louder, these pages could silence it. And if anyone ever doubted who the true creator was, I could lay this folder on the table and watch the lies collapse. For years I had lived with the quiet hurt of being unseen. But holding those drawings, feeling the grooves of my own pen, I knew the time for invisibility had ended. The truth had been hidden long enough, and now it was ready to be revealed. The room was too polished, too quiet, the kind of place where power hummed invisibly through the air. The long table gleamed, its surface untouched by the sweat or dust of the worksite. And yet it was here, in this sterile chamber, that the fate of the building and of my name would be decided. He was already seated when I entered, his suit immaculate, his smile rehearsed. The investors leaned toward him as though he carried the weight of genius in his pockets. They saw him as the visionary, the architect, the mind that had made steel rise into the sky. I was nothing more than a silent figure in the corner, a man they barely acknowledged. But that day, I carried more than silence with me. I carried the folder. I waited until the pleasantries faded, until his voice filled the room with the same practiced confidence, the same polished lies that had fooled so many for so long. He gestured to the building's photographs as though they were his own children, spoke of challenges overcome as though he had borne their weight himself. And then, when the room leaned in to believe him, I placed the folder on the table. The sound of it against the wood was louder than his voice, sharper than any accusation. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and spread the pages across the table. The yellowed edges, the ink that had dulled with time, the hand-drawn lines that carried more life than any printed rendering. They all spoke louder than I ever could. My signature, clear and undeniable, anchored every page. Calculations filled the margins, revisions layered over revisions, evidence of nights long before his speeches, proof that this building had been born in my solitude, not his spotlight. The room changed instantly. Silence settled heavy, thick, suffocating. The investors leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they traced the lines, the handwriting, the names at the bottom. Their attention shifted, slowly, inevitably, away from him. For the first time, they were looking at me, not as a worker, not as a man with tools, but as the origin of what stood behind us in glass and steel. I turned my eyes toward him then, and I will never forget what I saw. His face had lost its color. His practiced smile cracked around the edges. His voice caught in his throat before he could form an explanation. In that silence, the truth stood taller than the building itself. He knew it. I knew it. And now they knew it too. For years he had spoken louder, laughed harder, stood higher, certain that volume could bury truth. But truth does not need volume, it needs proof. And the proof lay before them, undeniable, written not in speeches or contracts, but in the ink of a hand that had given life to a dream. In that moment he understood. The story he had stolen no longer belonged to him. The mask he had worn so effortlessly had been stripped away, and behind it was nothing but emptiness. For the first time, it was he who stood small in the room, and I who stood tall without moving an inch. The revelation had come, and there was no undoing it. His voice broke the silence with a desperate edge I had never heard before. The same man who had always spoken with certainty, with confidence sharp enough to silence entire rooms, now stumbled over his own defense. "We did this together," he blurted out, trying to grasp at a rope that no longer existed. His words fell flat, brittle against the weight of the papers lying between us. For years he had relied on volume to make his lies sound like truth, but here, in this room, against the fragile strength of my faded ink, his voice was nothing more than noise. The signatures stared back at him like a mirror he could not shatter. My handwriting, my notes, my calculations, all of it undeniable, all of it mine. He leaned forward as though his proximity to the pages could make them his, as though his presence alone could overwrite what was written. But the more he spoke, the more hollow his defense became. His words scattered like dust in the heavy silence, while the ink, though quiet, carried the weight of years. Every line, every stroke on those drawings was heavier than his laughter, stronger than his charm, more permanent than his lies. I watched him unravel. The man who had built his image on control, who had stood on stages and smiled into cameras, was suddenly stripped bare. His face tightened, his hands twitched, his gaze darted from investor to investor, searching for belief, for support, for the illusion he had always been able to conjure. But belief is fragile when faced with proof, and the investor's eyes no longer followed him. They followed the lines on the paper. They followed my name. A fire rose in my chest as I listened to him stumble. Anger, yes, but not the wild anger that makes men reckless. This was something deeper, sharper, refined by years of silence and humiliation. It was the anger of a man who had watched his life stolen piece by piece, only to finally see it laid bare before the thieves and their audience. It was not rage that made me tremble now. It was justice pressing against my ribs, begging to break free. He tried again, louder this time, raising his voice as if shouting could smother the truth. He spoke of teamwork, of collaboration, of shared vision, but every time he reached for the word we, the signatures cut it down. There was no we on those pages. There was only me, my pen, my hand, my name. The truth was simple, and simplicity is the hardest thing to fight. And as his voice echoed, empty and frantic, I realized the balance of power had shifted. For years I had been the one cornered by silence, the one crushed under laughter and dismissal. But now it was him who stood cornered, his pride stripped, his lies exposed. I did not need to shout. I did not need to explain. The ink had spoken for me, and it spoke louder than he ever could. For the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of the truth he could no longer bury. And in that fear I found a strength I had almost forgotten. The strength of a man who knew that justice, though slow, had finally arrived. The room grew heavy with a silence so profound, it seemed to swallow even the sound of breathing. Just moments before, it had been filled with his voice, the confident rhythm of a man accustomed to being believed. Now, nothing remained but the soft rustle of paper as the investors leaned closer to the drawings spread across the table. Their eyes, once fixed on him as though he were the sun, shifted slowly, deliberately, toward me. It was not the kind of attention I had ever sought. For years I had lived in the shadows of my own work, content to let the building speak when no one else would. But now, as their gazes settled on me, I felt the full weight of what it meant to be seen. It wasn't applause. It wasn't recognition handed out like a prize. It was something deeper, sharper. The acknowledgement of truth after years of lies. They were not looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with understanding, and with the dawning realization that the story they had been told was not the story that had been lived. I could feel him next to me, shrinking in the silence he had once controlled. His body leaned forward as if he could pull their eyes back to him, but the silence resisted him. It held him down, exposed him, left him powerless. He had relied on noise, on charm, on the confidence of a voice that filled empty spaces. But now the empty spaces belonged to me. For the first time, I didn't need to speak. The room spoke for me. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the steady, relentless beat of something I thought I had lost: dignity. It filled me like air after drowning. Every sleepless night, every dismissed effort, every moment of being mocked as just good with tools rose within me, not as bitterness, but as proof that silence, when endured long enough, can become its own kind of thunder. The drawings, my signatures, my handwriting, they had cracked open the lie he had built around himself, and the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was justice, unspoken but undeniable. The investors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to certainty, from doubt to conviction. They didn't need me to argue. They didn't need him to explain. The truth lay on the table, plain as the lines that shaped the building itself. Their eyes told me they saw it now. They saw me, and in that moment I realized something that almost brought me to my knees. I no longer had to fight for them to believe me. The fight was over. The silence that followed was not cold. It was not cruel. It was the silence of recognition. The silence that falls when the truth finally steps into the light. For the first time in years, I was no longer invisible. I was undeniable. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremor before an earthquake. A single investor slid one of the drawings closer, his fingers tracing the ink of my signature as though to test its weight. Another leaned toward me, not him, and asked a question. Quiet, precise, directed only at me. The sound of my own name spoken aloud in that room felt foreign, almost startling, after so many years of silence. And yet it fit, as though it had been waiting in the air all along, unspoken, but inevitable. I answered carefully, my voice low but steady, and with each word I felt the balance of the room tilt. They listened, not with the half-attention given to a tool, not with the patronizing nod reserved for someone in the background, but with genuine gravity. Their eyes followed me, their pens scribbled notes, their heads nodded in unison. Questions came one after another, and every answer I gave stitched me further into the fabric of the truth that had been denied. He stood off to the side now, no longer the center of the circle, his once commanding presence shrinking into irrelevance. I could feel his desperation clinging to the edges of the room, a shadow that grew smaller with every glance redirected away from him. His smile was gone, his posture faltered, and in the shifting light of recognition, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. For years he had towered over me with nothing but confidence, but now confidence had deserted him, and without it he was hollow. The change was not dramatic, not loud. It was quiet, and yet it was absolute. The power he had stolen all those years, the authority he had wielded with a smirk and a handshake, was slipping from his hands, dissolving into nothing he could hold. And it wasn't me who had taken it back. It was the truth itself. Truth had simply stood up, brushed the dust from its shoulders, and reclaimed the place that had always belonged to it. For the first time, I stepped out of the shadow I had been forced into, not by shouting, not by demanding, but by standing still while others came to me. They approached with questions, with respect, with the kind of acknowledgement I had thought I would never feel. It wasn't triumph that filled me then. It was something deeper, quieter, but more powerful than triumph. It was belonging. It was dignity restored. I glanced toward him once, and in his eyes I saw it. The moment he understood he had lost everything he thought was his. Not the building. It had never truly been his. Not the respect. It had always been borrowed. What he lost was the illusion of power, the mask of ownership that had carried him for so long. Stripped of that, he was nothing but a man standing on the sidelines, watching as the world turned away. And me, I was no longer the man with tools. I was the architect of truth. Justice does not always arrive with the sound of gavels or the weight of courts. Sometimes it comes quietly, in ink and print, in headlines that spread across a city like a rising dawn. Days after that meeting, I saw my name where I had long believed it would never be, on the front pages, in bold letters that cut through years of silence. The true architect named. Those words carried more than recognition. They carried restoration. They carried everything that had been taken from me, piece by piece, lie by lie, and returned it in a single breath. I walked through streets where no one had ever looked twice at me, and suddenly people stopped. Some nodded in acknowledgement, some whispered, some reached out just to say they had read my story. There was no need for speeches, no need for me to defend myself anymore. The papers, the photographs, the interviews all echoed the same truth. I was the one who had dreamed, designed, and delivered the structure that now touched the sky. My building, my work, my name. And yet, it wasn't pride that filled me as I read those lines. It was something heavier, more fragile. Relief. Relief that the years of erasure had not won. Relief that my silence had not buried me forever. For so long, I had feared that my work would live on without me, that history would remember only the lie. But justice had a way of breaking through, and when it came, it did not shout. It simply stood firm, undeniable, and demanded to be seen. I thought of the countless nights when I signed my name at the bottom of each page, not knowing if it would ever mean anything, only knowing that it mattered to me. And now those signatures had spoken louder than every insult, every dismissal, every smirk that had once tried to reduce me to nothing. They had not only proven my role, they had rewritten the story, returned it to its rightful owner. He disappeared from the papers as quickly as I emerged. Where once his face had filled the news, now it was absent. Where once his words had shaped the story, now they were forgotten. Justice is not always cruel. It does not always destroy. Sometimes it simply reveals, and in revealing it strips away the false and leaves only what can stand. And he, without lies to shield him, could not stand. Each article, each headline, each retelling of the truth felt like a brick placed back where it had been stolen, rebuilding the wall of my dignity. The world now knew my name, but more importantly, it knew the truth. And truth, once revealed, can never be hidden again. Justice had arrived. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in the simple, steady way of light breaking through a window after years of darkness. I walked away from the crowd, from the meetings, from the noise of voices that had once tried to define me. My steps carried me back to the place where it had all begun, where mud clung to my boots and laughter had cut like knives. The building rose before me now in silence, no longer a skeleton of beams or an unfinished promise, but a finished truth that towered over the city. Its glass caught the fading light of evening, painting the sky in fire and gold, and for the first time, I looked at it without bitterness. For the first time, I saw not the theft, not the betrayal, not the years of being dismissed, but what it truly was. Proof. It was not a monument to him, though he had tried to make it so. It was not a monument to their laughter, their doubt, or the silence they forced upon me. It stood now as a monument to endurance, to patience, to the unshakable power of truth. Every floor was a testimony, every line a declaration, every beam a reminder that lies can climb high, but they cannot last. Only truth can carry the weight of stone and steel without collapse. I stopped at the base and tilted my head back, my eyes tracing its height until it vanished into the sky. I thought of the first trembling lines on paper, the nights when I feared my hands were not enough, the moments when I almost believed the voices that told me I was just a worker, just a man with tools. And I thought of how those same hands had carved this dream out of nothing, how those same tools had built not only a building but a legacy. He had said once, with that smirk that still tried to haunt me, "You're just good with tools." At the time, it had felt like chains, as though those words had locked me into a life of invisibility. But now, standing before what I had created, I understood. Yes, I was good with tools, I was good with lines, with steel, with stone, with silence, with endurance. And being good with tools had built something greater than his voice ever could. Tools in my hands had built a dream that touched the sky. And no smirk, no lie, no stolen credit could take that away. The city knew now. Not because I demanded it, not because I shouted louder, but because the truth had finally found its foundation. My name had risen from the shadows, etched not only on paper, but in memory, in stone, in the skyline itself. People would pass this building for generations and speak of the architect who had given it life. My children, their children, strangers I would never meet, each of them would know that it was mine. As the last light of the sun slid across its surface, the glass glowed like fire, and for a moment it felt as though the building was alive, breathing, carrying my heart within its walls. I turned to leave, my steps steady, my back straight. I did not need to look over my shoulder to know what stood there. It would always stand, not as a monument to betrayal, but as the eternal reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always rises. And as I walked away, I smiled, not for revenge, not for pride, but for the quiet certainty that justice had finally taken its shape in steel and glass. I was no longer the man they mocked, no longer the shadow in the corner, no longer just good with tools. I was the one who had built the dream, and now the whole world knew it.